Welcome back to another crash course. Now, previous episode was aerodynamics. Now we're looking at the air in aerodynamics because aeroplanes live in air. We need to understand the situation that we're in and the weather. We're not going to go too much into meteorology, but we'll look at what it is we need to know because this stuff is modelled in DCS, so I'll try and be as concise as possible. Up on the top left, you'll look at my depiction of particles. Now, you'd think that hot air is higher pressure. That's wrong. When it comes to atmospheric pressure, hot air is actually low pressure because there's not much pushing down on the particles at the bottom, so we count that as low pressure. High pressure is usually colder. Now, this is where it gets a little bit funny because you can have different weather systems and that kind of stuff, and the pressure can always be different, but generally colder air is higher pressure. So why does this matter? Well, when you're landing at Caucasus in winter and it's 0 degrees or whatnot, you've got very thick air. It's nice to glide through. There's no real problems. Now, we're disregarding wind or anything like that. Or on the inverse, if you're landing in Syria in 45 centigrade or above, the air is very loose. It's low pressure and it's very turbulent. There's not much to glide through. It's a bit choppy. The wings wobble a little bit. So you're trying to land on a carrier that's going to be a little bit hairy. That is modelled in DCS. So just be aware that that can change the conditions. While we're talking about density and temperature, the higher up you go, the colder it gets. So I think it's something like the general rule is every 1,000 feet it gets 2 degrees colder. Now that does actually affect DCS because when it gets to a particular condition and you fly through a cloud, if the cloud's moisture, you'll get ice on your aircraft. But if it's really cold, then it'll be powder and you'll just fly through the cloud. That's modelled in DCS as well. So as you go higher up, it gets colder and the air gets thinner. The thinner the air, the more your aeroplane is going to starve. So we've got oxygen, fuel and fire there. They're pretty much the three things that run your engine. So without having the right condition, the right mixture of those three, you're in trouble. Now, later on, I'll in the practical, you'll be able to see what I mean, but not too much. It'll just give you an idea of how that affects things in the practical. But the World War II aircraft, it's definitely more pronounced because you have a mixture lever, and that'll make it either fuel rich or oxygen rich. And depending on your altitude, say you're lower, the air's denser, you don't need that much oxygen, so you can have more fuel. And if you're higher up, you need to open that up more to get more oxygen in. So the way they got around that with some of the old aircraft is they put in a supercharger. So the Mustang has a supercharger to suck in more air to feed it at those higher altitudes. There's little things like that you don't really need to be aware of. The Mustang has a supercharger, but you need to be aware that the oxygen will run out the higher you go. And that's why aircraft have a ceiling as well. You might notice you get to a particular point where instead of climbing really quickly, it might take you another half an hour to get 500 feet in the air. That's purely because the engines aren't producing enough power because there's not enough oxygen getting in there. And engines work differently. The ceiling with the A10 is different from the ceiling of the F-18 and whatnot. So you just need to be aware of how high this aircraft can go. Going back to freezing everything if you're going through a cloud and picking up all that moisture and getting ice. Say for instance you're in the Hornet, you can actually ice up the air intakes and cause problems with the oxygen because you're not getting enough oxygen into the air intake. So you need to be aware on your aircraft what heating options you have. One of the heating options that you have is a Pitot Tube. You might read that as Pitot and you've gone, oh, what is that? Well, Pitot is a Pitot Tube, and what that does is it gives you various information, but mostly has to do with air pressure. So as you can see, this little weird pen thing I've drawn with the particles going in the end, that's basically what a Pitot Tube is. It's just a tube that takes in air from the outside world, and depending on the pressure and the airflow through the pitot tube, it can give you your airspeed, and it can also give you your altitude, because there's a little pressure breathing little harmonica, not harmonica, there's a thing in there like a little bladder that opens up with the pressure, and then it alternatively tells you what altitude you're at. Now, if your pitot tube ices up while you're going through those clouds, you're going to be going, hey, why is my airspeed at 0 and why am I at 1,000 feet and that's not changing? Well, that'll be because your pitot tube's iced up and you'll need to de-ice it. Or, better yet, you understand the conditions and you turn the pitot heating on before you take off, which you generally do in the A10. That thing always goes on as part of your takeoff. So, with the air pressure, it gets denser, obviously, the closer you get to the ground. That also gives us the bonus that we can tell through the air pressure in that in the pitot tube how high we are because of the air pressure outside, but only if we match that to the atmospheric conditions, and that's where your QFE or QNH come in. That's that little number. Now, the standard textbook condition is 29.92 inches in mercury, and I think it's something like 1013.25. I'm just pulling that out of the top of my head for hectopascals. But we don't need to worry about hectopascals because pretty much all the aircraft that I've come across in DCS all run in inches in mercury. So 29.92. It's actually a little bit different, but 29.2 is 29.92 is what we dial in. Now, the pitot tube, because it measures the outside pressure, it doesn't really have an understanding of what the atmospheric pressure is. It just reads the differences. So you need to tell it what the atmospheric pressure is in order for it to tell the difference of altitude that you're in. So when you're on the ground, you can dial in QFE, which is the airfield height. What that means basically is you turn the knob on the altimeter until it hits 0. Now you're at QFE, you're set to QFE, which is handy for landing and takeoff, because as you're coming in with the QFE, you can see that altimeter slowly tick down to 0 feet, and then you know you're on the ground kind of thing. Whereas QNH is the air pressure at sea level. So if you dial that in, that'll give you an accurate height for pretty much anything. So someone can give you the airfield QFE, they can say 29.92 for the airfield to set your altimeter to 0, or they can give you a QNH and just say the airfield is, 200 feet above sea level kind of thing. So to kind of, it's a tough one to get your head around without any kind of real representation, but if you have a look at my little terrible A10 here, that I didn't draw in paint but that NASA sent me, where it says altitude 2000. So his altimeter says that he's at 2000 feet, when in actual fact he's not, because if you look at the mountains are at 1,500 and they're higher than him. Why is that? That's because he set his altimeter incorrectly. It is possible to get the wrong altitude. Say for instance that airfield was below sea level through having a concave kind of land formation, and he's below sea level by 5,000 feet or something. No, not by 5,000 feet, but you know what I mean. He's below sea level, and he sets his QFE so that he's got his altimeter tells him that he's at 0 feet. When he takes off and he comes across mountains, he's going to say, oh, these mountains must be 3,500 feet. But they're not. They're actually 1,500 feet above sea level. So you need to be aware that the altimeter, it's actually quite important to get that QFE or QNH and dial that into the altimeter, because otherwise that altimeter is completely useless. it's up to you to put in the atmospheric pressure, and then it will give you the information back that you require. Garbage in, garbage out. So all in all, to sum up, air density matters, temperature matters, you don't want to starve your engine, you don't want to ice anything, and out of the things that you want to ice, don't want to ice, is the Pitot Tube, because that will give you your airspeed and your altitude. And your altitude is important. It is possible to screw up where your altitude is, because you need to know what the atmospheric pressure is in order to put it into the altimeter. The altimeter can be set to different things like QFE or QNH. It's up to you how you use it, but you can make mistakes. Say for instance, you set that QFE low, you set it to QFE, but that's below sea level. You've got the autopilot on, you put it into a turn or whatever, you increase the altitude, but the altitude's not increased enough because the aircraft thinks it's at 2,000 feet, when in actual fact it's only at 1,000 feet. You know that the mountain is 1,500, you think, I'm safe. No, you're not. You need to be aware of that barometric setting that you can do in the altimeter. So moving forward, we've looked at the pitot for pressure. We've discussed the environment that we're flying in. So that's really the basics of that. We're not going to go too much further. You just need to be very aware of how these things work, because they are modeled in DCS. The next one will probably go into, it's going to be a very quick one, because we're going to be just explaining the airspeeds, because I've briefly touched on that. We'll need to go in and discuss that topic in the next one. That'll be a very short video, but thank you for watching. I hope you found this helpful. Feel free to come back if you're enjoying these. The next series might not be for a while yet, because there's quite a few episodes in this kind of skill range, but the next series I'm not quite sure yet what we're going to get through, what we're going to tackle, but we might have to start narrowing it down, because after this we'll have to look at weapons and that kind of thing, but I'm not exactly sure where we're going with that. But thanks for watching, keep going, and yeah, thank you.